Thank you, Linda, for that warm welcome. And I can't tell you, it's just such an honor to be with you all here today, to be with so many wonderful women. If you're ever looking for a funny movie, check out Baby Boom with Diane Keaton. The plot and the feel of the movie is vintage 1980s, which I know is ancient history for many of you. The story goes like this. Keaton plays J.D. Wyatt, a very successful advertising executive in New York City. She appears to have it all. A dynamic career, she's on track to make partner, a successful boyfriend, and a lot of 1980s power suits, combined with the very big, mannish shoulder pads. It's funny, if you look at JD's wardrobe, and even some of your own clothes from the 80s, you may be tempted to ask, how could we have been so duped? Anyway, one day JD gets a surprise call at the office. A long-lost relative has died, and she has inherited not a watch, not silverware, but a baby girl. She assumes this must be some kind of crazy mistake, but is pressured into taking care of the baby, named Elizabeth, as an emergency measure, till a suitable home can be found for her. With an unexpected baby in her life, things get pretty messy for JD. There are many funny scenes. It's clear that she's never changed a diaper, so that's fun to watch. And when she can't get a babysitter, she just brings the baby to work and drops her off with the receptionist as she goes into her big meeting. JD valiantly tries to juggle it all. And before long, she has fallen in love with the little girl. So when the social worker tells her that an adoptive parent has been found, and JD actually meets this scary lady, she goes, is that better? She realizes she can't give Elizabeth up. And this is when complications really develop. The boyfriend checks out. He didn't sign up for this after all. And JD continues to struggle due new motherhood and her career in the big city. And pretty quickly, she's told that her work is slipping and her partnership will be on hold. The managing partner, who is a man, tells JD that she just can't have it all. Sacrifices have to be made if she wants to get the big accounts. He even admits that he's been married to his career for so long that he doesn't even know how many grandchildren he has. JD rails against the injustice of it all, and then something in her seems to snap. Under pressure from some bloodthirsty colleagues, she agrees to take a financial package and quit her job. She's not sure what to do next. Then, on a whim, she buys what looks like a lovely farmhouse in Vermont. She'd seen the ad on it for it in the newspaper, but of course this was before the internet. She and Elizabeth moved to the farm, and things are not what the once powerful executive bargained for. The farmhouse is dilapidated, a money pit, and the opportunities for intellectual and social stimulation are few and far between in this backwoods town. JD's nerves get so frazzled that she runs into the local doctor's office and pours out her heart to him. Needless to say, she's totally mortified when she learns that he treats horses, not people. He's handsome and charming, but he's a veterinarian. Out of boredom, really, JD starts making applesauce from the apples in her huge and dilapidated orchard. It turns out she has a real knack for this, and soon local stores are buying up her applesauce, which she has called Country Baby. And slowly, JD even begins to make friends in the quirky town. She falls for the doctor, and of course he falls for her too. And all the while, Elizabeth is really thriving, and much to her surprise, so is JD. Before long, the applesauce business has become a mini empire, helped along by JD's marketing skills. Country Baby is such a success that JD's old employer in New York City has a group that wants to buy her out. Talk about a reversal of fortunes. The old boss says they want to make her an offer she can't refuse. And it looks like she won't refuse it until she does. She says no thanks. After all that has happened since she left the Big Apple, JD now sees things somewhat differently. Her perspective and priorities have changed. Elizabeth, who is now the center of her life, has clearly had an effect on her. JD seems more grounded and much less nervous and agitated. She laughs more and seems genuinely interested in the people in the community, especially the handsome doctor. She's also a respected local employer, part of the fabric of people's lives. One of the things I always loved about this movie was that by the end, JD is again a very successful businesswoman, but on her terms. She can manage the business in a way that allows her also to be devoted to Elizabeth, and she's making a real difference in the lives of many around her. Why focus on this movie? Is there a moral to the story? If there is, I don't think it is that women can't have big careers in the city or the country and be good mothers at the same time. We all know many women who do this brilliantly. And is JD perfect or a model of great behavior all the time? No, and this is not an explicitly Christian movie. But I do think it's a comic and touching story of one woman who experiences a transformation in her understanding of what it means to thrive as a woman in her world. Even JD's name, like a man's initials, suggests she had thought she had to hide the woman in her to get along in what seemed like a man's world. But as we see, through her frustration, tears, hard work, lots of laughs, and the surprises of life, JD emerges happier and energized. As she lets her natural strengths and inclinations lead, it is as if she almost gives birth to herself. I know this is just a movie, but I think it's a fun way of helping us think about what it does mean to live authentically as a woman in the modern world. Some, including St. John Paul II, as Linda had mentioned, he was Pope from 1978 to 2005. He would even go so far as to speak about the genius of women. And as you can see from the title of your tickets, and as Linda mentioned, this is the focus of my talk today. But before we consider this particular idea, I want to take a short theological detour. Before we consider what might be distinctive about a woman's way of being in the world, we should affirm the basics of our faith regarding all persons, men and women. One of the core teachings of our faith is that each and every person has an immense dignity. Why? What's so special about us? What distinguishes us from raccoons or robots? As the Catechism teaches, the dignity of the human person is rooted in his creation in the image and likeness of God. It is fulfilled in his vocation to divine beatitude. Translation, please. We were created for nothing less than eternal communion with God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's our vocation, ultimately. We must have great dignity indeed if this is the celebration to which we have all been invited. As the Second Vatican Council stressed, and as John Paul never tired of saying, women and men are the only creatures of the visible world that God willed for their own sakes. Yes, we must absolutely respect and protect the environment and all of God's creatures, and we haven't always done a very good job of this. But humans and dolphins are different. So it will be interesting to see what Pope Francis has to say in his letter on the environment, which will soon be published. A second fundamental truth of our faith is that woman and man share equally in human nature and dignity. The book of Genesis tells us that before the creation of Eve, Adam was alone with the plants and the animals, and he knew it. And it was God who acknowledged this and said it was not good. So it's not surprising that Adam expressed his great delight when Eve came on the scene. He saw another who was a person like him, and flesh of his flesh and bone of his bones, but who was also obviously different from him in some important ways. The scripture scholars tell us that the fact that Eve is made from the same matter as Adam leaves no doubt about their equal dignity as humans. Eve is a helpmate to Adam, but he is a helpmate to her also. In God's original plan for us, there is no superiority of man over woman, nor of woman over man. There is no domination, no violence. There are no gender wars. Tragically, all of this was introduced when the first humans decided to live on their own terms rather than God's. The terrible distortions of God's original plan for human life and love are the result of sin. But speaking of Eve's creation from the side of Adam reminds me of a joke. but is a joke that only makes sense once sin has entered the world. So Eve comes home from a long day at the hospital. She'd been doing open heart surgery all day. She sees Adam in the dining room at the table working on his laptop, but she notices that he has a bandage on his side, pretty close to his rib. Her jaw drops, she looks dismayed, and she says to him, "Please tell me there isn't another woman." The seminarians love that one too. Because Adam and Eve are both fully human, yet different in some important ways, they're often described as complementary to each other. My dictionary defines complementarity as enhancing or completing the qualities of something else. It's not as if Adam and Eve are like thing one and thing two existing beside each other. Rather, Genesis tells us that they exist for each other, and that each helps the other to understand himself or herself. To speak of complementarity is to say that each brings something different and essential to the table. This is clear when we think about God's plan for our participation in the creation of new human life. Both man and woman make an indispensable contribution, at least in the old-fashioned way of doing it. It's always helpful when science aligns with the convictions of faith, and sometimes affirms that man and woman are both fully human and yet different in some important ways. So I've been fascinated by the work of an eminent neuropsychiatrist, Dr. Lou-Anne Brizantine. She has published very interesting and provocative findings on the differences between the male and female brains. For example, she has much to say about the influence of various hormones on our brains. And I suspect most of us are all too familiar with the role of hormones in our lives. Obviously, Dr. Brizantine is not arguing that women's brains are somehow inferior. Hers clearly is not. But she does present the data on verifiable differences. So if you're looking for some fascinating summer reading, you can always check out her books, The Female Brain and The Male Brain. Not surprisingly, those with an ideological commitment to the idea that there are no real differences between the sexes are not fans of this kind of work. But it seems that science is moving in the other direction. And so are many corporations. Just this week, I read an article in the paper which was calling for senior management to ensure that companies have greater gender diversity on their boards. As it was reported, a 2004 Catalyst study found that companies with women in top management positions experience better financial performance than their peers. Why? Well, it is acknowledged that women bring a different, again, some would say complementary perspective, and this seems to be good for business. So, we have seen that both men and women possess a tremendous dignity and are complementary in some important ways. As mentioned above, our faith also teaches that we're made in the image and likeness of God. We are the imago Dei. God himself is a life-giving communion of persons. The three persons love each other in the intimate mystery of one divine life. It only stands to reason that if we are in God's image and likeness, and he is a communion of persons, we too are called to interpersonal communion. Indeed, as John Paul never tired of saying, our self-realization, our true happiness, can only be found through a sincere gift of self. Translation? What is the meaning and purpose of life? To be in relationship, to give ourselves away for others. And this gets to the heart of our faith, because this is exactly what Christ did for us. Through his death, life and death on the cross, he made a total gift of self for each and every one of us. As we recall on Good Friday, he loved us to the end, with his body and soul. So each of us, woman or man, is called to make a total gift of self. And it is Christ who makes it possible for us to do so. This can be seen in marriage, where two people vow to love each other as Christ loves us. It is also manifest in the lives of priests and nuns, who give all that they are and have to Christ and his church. And single people are also called to find creative ways of making a gift of self with their lives. No one is exempt from the adventure. And this is the paradox, no, of which the Gospels speak. Only in giving ourselves away do we truly gain life. So that's the end of the theological detour, and now back to our main topic. What, if anything, is distinctive about the way that women make their gift? What is meant by this expression, the feminine genius? Always keeping in mind the special dignity of all persons, here are some of John Paul's own words, and Linda has introduced one document I'll refer to, but these words come from an apostolic letter which he wrote in 1988, just 1 year, in fact, after Baby Boom was released. I'm not sure he was responding to the movie, but we'll never know. It is called The Dignity and Vocation of Women. John Paul reflects on the experience of motherhood. As he observes, motherhood implies from the beginning a special openness to the new person, and this is precisely the woman's part. In conceiving and giving birth, the woman discovers herself through a sincere gift of self. Motherhood involves a special communion with the mystery of life. And, he says, this unique contact with the new human being developing within her gives rise to an attitude towards every human being, not only towards her own child, but every human being, which profoundly marks the woman's personality. So according to John Paul, there is something about motherhood that makes a woman especially attuned to other people. One of the most beautiful compliments I ever heard given was that a particular woman who happened to be a mother could talk to anybody in any social situation. She had a knack for finding the person in the room who seemed the most ill at ease and helping them to feel more comfortable. But before we go any further, I want to mention men. In his reflections on women, the Pope is certainly not arguing for some kind of a reverse discrimination, as if women are actually better. I hope that it's possible to affirm certain gifts without necessarily putting other people down. Today we are focusing on women, but we also do need to talk about what many think are the distinctive gifts and strengths of men. There is, in fact, a growing body of literature that indicates that men now need some affirmation and encouragement too. I've even heard of some schools, and this is quite serious, that have started men's studies programs. But that's a talk for another day. The Pope is not saying that men can't be devoted to others or that they can't be nurturing and supportive. We all know wonderful men who are all these things and more. But he does say that there is something different about women. And based on everything else he said and did, I'm pretty sure that John Paul is not saying that the only place for a woman, as the saying goes, is barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. John Paul is not saying that everything about us can be reduced to biology, some kind of a biological determinism, if you want the technical term for it. No, as the imago Dei, as the image of God, we're always body and soul, and we have been gifted with reason and free will. We have the capacity then to make self-defining choices. However, we do live in a society that seems to be increasingly anti-life and even anti-child sometimes. John Paul was always encouraging women and men to see children for the amazing gifts that they are. He was always reminding us of what a wonderful privilege and responsibility it is to be involved in the procreation of a new human life. Even if it isn't politically correct in some circles, in his reflections on women, John Paul is inviting us to deal with reality. He's asking us to acknowledge that the feminine body is different from the masculine body. There are some obvious manifestations of these differences, and there are some that are not so apparent. For example, as Dr. Brizantine reports, women have more connectors between the two sides of their brains. This is thought-provoking, to say the least. One significant feature of the female body is that we literally have an empty space within us, the womb or the uterus. As Katrina Zeno, a Christian feminist, puts it, we are created to be receptive and to be life-giving. Our very physical being is oriented towards giving and receiving life. And even if a woman never gives birth to a child, the idea is that this capacity within her to bear a child still tends to shape her consciousness, her emotions, and her psyches, and her way of being in the world. Simply stated, we're built to be other-oriented, and this means we tend to develop a capacity for the other, if this inclination is not denied or thwarted. Of course, women do not necessarily develop this way. Again, we have free will, and we can always cultivate different and even opposing sensibilities and attitudes. We can get in the habit of thinking only of self and turning our back on life in all its forms. Or we may become too focused on technology and try to control everything. We live in a very pragmatic culture, and it's so easy to slip into a mindset that values efficiency and pragmatism above all else. It's easy to lose sight of other people. But the good news is that each of us is a work in progress until the day we die. J.D. Wyatt was clearly a work in progress. Some might even say that she had been a victim of a culture created by a false understanding, which told her lies. Lies such as, there really aren't any differences between the sexes, or if you want to succeed, you have to act like a man. But happily, she decided she wanted to grow in another direction. The advice she would give Elizabeth about how to succeed as a woman in life probably would be quite different from what she had received. There is always room for growth, for learning how to be more attuned and available to others. As Pope Francis never tires of saying, God's mercy is always offered. We just have to ask for it. I sometimes wonder if the prodigal son had a silent sister, the prodigal daughter. But God runs out to meet us, each one of us, wherever we are. The really dangerous thing is to be duped into thinking that any of us is ever beyond repair. Still, I have to admit that the first time I read John Paul's letter on women, I got a little worried. There seemed to be so much emphasis on motherhood, and I wondered, what about the many women who struggle with the devastation of infertility? And we know all of them. What about all my wonderful single girlfriends? What about all the great religious sisters I had met? Even if their psyche or consciousness had been shaped in a certain direction, did they somehow have less feminine genius or a diminished capacity for others because they were not biological mothers? Were the critics of John Paul right? Were his views out of touch with the experience of many women? Well, I'm glad that I read on. I didn't throw the book down. In the very next section, John Paul goes on to discuss something called spiritual motherhood. As Katrina Zeno says, spiritual motherhood involves nurturing the emotional, moral, cultural, and spiritual life of others. This was an aha moment for me. I thought about all the spiritual mothers I know. I have a friend who is single and very devoted, beyond the call of duty, to her work as a guidance counselor. I have no doubt that she is nurturing her students in all kinds of amazing ways. I also have a friend who works as an administrative assistant in a big office. She never forgets the personal events, the birthdays, the anniversaries of those around her. She is the one who organizes everyone to go out when there is something to celebrate. It seems as if no one is invisible to her. I also thought of the many wonderful sisters of life I have met. This is an order of nuns that was founded in 1991 by the late Cardinal O'Connor of New York. Interestingly, these sisters, if you meet them, tend to be young, full of joy, and very hip. The Cardinal realized that pregnant women often find themselves in very tragic and difficult circumstances. He also understood that women and their children need emotional and material support. Talk is cheap, especially when newborns are involved. So he founded an order whose work is to support life in very concrete and gentle ways. The sisters are the people to call if any woman thinks she can't have her baby. While they were starting in New York, they now have a community here in Toronto, and they are doing amazing things. Thinking of spiritual mothers also made me think of a dear friend who was a law partner in Vancouver. She never pushed her faith on anyone, but she was always willing to talk about it when asked. And she used to have a lot of fun with this. If she were out with friends for drinks and the people started asking questions, she would answer them. She would sometimes call this her bar evangelization. And sometimes it yielded some pretty interesting results. Wherever women are supporting life and affirming human dignity, nurturing the moral, the emotional, the spiritual, and cultural in others, they are being spiritual mothers. I suspect that most women don't fully appreciate the positive impact they're having on those around them. There is spiritual motherhood when an elderly woman in the community runs the Out of the Cold program. There is spiritual motherhood, I think, when a teenage girl shows leadership and makes sure that the members of her hockey team are kind and welcoming to a new player. Or think of the widow who always takes the initiative and organizes the social events in her condo or parish. She is obviously nurturing her friends, responding to the need they have for relationality. That's spiritual motherhood too. Spiritual motherhood could also involve listening to and supporting a friend who is in crisis. Perhaps her marriage is going through an especially difficult period, or maybe a child has made some bad choices. There are clearly times when friends need emotional, moral, and spiritual support. Acts of spiritual motherhood can show friends the love of Christ. Of course, biological mothers need to be spiritual mothers too. The delivery room is just the beginning. We all know that parents are pulled in a million directions these days. So the mother who puts the family dinner together and then sits down for real conversation with her children is providing nourishment beyond what is on the table. This is all the more the case when she nourishes the faith of her children. A woman can also be a spiritual mother to her children's friend. Perhaps his home is not a peaceful and stable place, and she lets him know that he is always welcome in their home. To summarize what I've been saying so far, I think John Paul is telling us that every woman is called to give birth in some way. Our purpose and joy in life is to make a gift of self. For many, this will involve physical births, but there must always be spiritual births. We are called to pass on the life and all the graces we have received, especially our faith, thereby nurturing and supporting others. We give expression to our feminine genius by bringing attention back to human persons, the only creatures on earth that God has willed for their own sakes. But here's a cautionary note. Motherhood, biological or spiritual, does not mean being a doormat. It's not about helping others grow into dependency. It's about helping them grow into authentic freedom and moral and spiritual maturity. According to John Paul, today more than ever, society is desperately in need of the contribution of women. As Linda mentioned, in 1995, he wrote a letter to the women of the world, to us. Yes, he was a busy man. You can Google the letter, and it makes for some interesting and sometimes very surprising reading. Here's what John Paul had to say about progress, about making the world a truly better place. Progress usually tends to be measured according to the criteria of science and technology. Not from this point of view has the contribution of women been negligible. And reading this made me think of our own Canadian physicist, Ursula Franklin, who made enormous contributions in this area. Even so, this is not the only measure of progress, nor, in fact, is it the principal one. Much more important is the social and ethical dimension, which deals with human relations and spiritual values. In this area, which often develops in an inconspicuous way, beginning with daily relationships between people, maybe around the coffee table, but especially within the family, society certainly owes much to the genius of women. Does this mean that women shouldn't be astronauts, economists, or politicians? Absolutely not. But isn't there often something different about the way they make their contributions in these areas? At their best, isn't it the case that women also bring the focus back to real people, reminding us that it is never just about systems and technology? Do women really humanize society? This week, there was an interesting story in the Wall Street Journal about young women engineering students. The story caught my eye because I have a wonderful niece who is a young engineering student. The story reports some interesting statistics. At Apple, the company, only 20% of the tech jobs are held by women. At Google, only 17% are. However, recent enrollment in prestigious engineering programs indicates that if the content of the work is more socially meaningful, women enroll in very high numbers. For example, in 2014, the University of California at Berkeley offered a new PhD minor for engineering students whose research is focused on solutions for low-income communities. Half of the students in the first class were women. And a lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology focuses on developing technologies to improve the lives of people in poverty. 74% of students last year were women. These are only anecdotes, but they do provide food for thought. There are so many spheres where women can put the focus on the needs and hopes of real people. As John Paul said in one World Day Peace message, it's necessary to strive convincingly to ensure that the widest possible space is open to women in all areas of culture, economics, politics, and ecclesial life itself, so that all human society is increasingly enriched by the gifts proper to masculinity and femininity. And what about women's participation in the life of the church? John Paul had much to say about this too. For example, he spoke about and honored the contributions women make teaching theology, this made me smile, in pastoral ministry, in pastoral and administrative councils, in ecclesiastical tribunals, for example. And I suspect many of you here would agree that a parish council is much more effective, or the Family of Faith campaign is much more effective when dynamic women are involved.
Yes.
Pope Francis seems to appreciate this as well, and he has called for consideration of new ways of involving women in decision-making structures in the church. He spoke of this in his first encyclical, The Joy of the Gospel. But we should be clear, whenever we talk about participation in the church, at root we're always talking about opportunities for service, not a power struggle. Mother Teresa, a spiritual mother if ever there were one, demonstrated by her life that no one is excluded from the most important work or opportunities in the church, the opportunities to serve in love. While society desperately needs the gifts of women, what should not be forgotten is the role of women in the family. As John Paul observed, the challenge for most societies today is that of upholding, strengthening women's role in the family, while at the same time making it possible for her to use all her talents and exercise her rights in building up society. There is no easy fix for the tension experienced by so many women in this area. But surely the way forward is not to make the pre-Elizabeth or the pre-JD Vermont the model for all of us. Surely the answer is not to deny the feminine genius. Only by affirming the full truth of women and motherhood will lasting social progress be made. As John Paul argues in his letter to women, much remains to be done to prevent discrimination against those who have chosen to be wives and mothers. As far as personal rights are concerned, there's an urgent need to achieve real equality in every area. Equal pay for equal work, protection for mothers working, fairness in career advancements, equality of spouses with regard to family rights. This is true. And how can we create a culture that is truly affirming of the gifts and sacrifices made by those women who stay home to raise their children without pay and often with little social recognition? How can we support these women and their families? They are often invisible heroines. Pope John Paul's method is never abstract. In fact, some would say he's quite feminine in this. His meditative style is always calling us to reflect on our own experiences to see if what he's saying rings true. He's always confident that the truth will do its own convincing. So I now invite you to think of all the women in your own lives who have borne witness to their own feminine genius, always bringing attention and concern back to real people. These could be mothers, grandmothers, sisters, aunts, nieces, friends, neighbors. You get the idea. Who are they, and in what way have they nurtured you and the people you know? With Mother's Day next week, it's time to honor all of our mothers, the biological and the spiritual. And so I will read John Paul's own word of thanks to the women of the world. And I noticed, great minds think alike, that this thank you message is included in our program for today. So if you need a little pep talk sometime at home, you can read it again. So he says, "Thank you, women who are mothers. You have sheltered human beings within yourselves in a unique experience of joy and travail. This experience makes you become God's own smile upon the newborn child, the one who guides your child's first steps, who helps it to grow, and who is the anchor as the child makes its way along the journey of life. Thank you, women who are wives. You irrevocably join your future to that of your husbands in a relationship of mutual giving at the service of love and life. Thank you, women who are daughters and women who are sisters. Into the heart of the family and then all of society, you bring the richness of your sensitivity, your intuitiveness, your generosity, and fidelity." Then he says, "Thank you, women who work." And I think he's speaking directly to women who work outside the home, but I don't think any of us knows any woman who doesn't work very hard wherever she is. But as he says, "You are present and active in every area of life, social, economic, cultural, artistic, and political. In this way, you make an indispensable contribution to the growth of a culture, which unites reason and feeling, to a model of life ever open to the mystery of life, to the establishment of economic and political structures ever more worthy of humanity." And he says, "Thank you, consecrated women. Following the example of the greatest of women, the Mother of Christ, you open yourselves with obedience and fidelity to the gift of God's love." And what about us? How are we tapping into our own feminine genius? Can we take it further? As we think about our own lives, it's important to keep in mind that each of us actually has a unique personal vocation to live out. Most of us, I think, when we hear the word vocation, think of a priest or a sister, someone with a formal position or vocation in the church. But there's much more to the story. As Christians, each of us has a baptismal vocation. We're called to live the truth of our faith in the world. We also have a vocation in terms of the state of life. We're talking here about being a priest, a sister, the single state, the married state. But what is often overlooked is our unique personal vocation. We believe that in His providence, God has a special loving plan for each and every one of us. He has called each of us to do some important work that no one else can do. You might say that each of us should be qualified as an essential worker. Speaking of unique vocation, Mary has given us a beautiful example describing her own journey and the work that she's taken on. One writer puts it this way: "Our unique personal vocation takes in all of a person's circumstances, strengths and weaknesses, talents and disabilities, existing commitments and obligations, and requires that all one's choices be made in light of it." Obviously, no two women have the same life story or faith journey. If you had told me 25 years ago, or when I was 25, let's put it that way, that one day I would be teaching ethics courses in a seminary, I would have laughed very hard. The one thing I never wanted to do was teach. And I absolutely dreaded the idea of speaking in front of a large crowd. But somehow, and sometimes in spite of myself, God used any gifts He gave me, and even some failures and disappointments, to get me where He seems to want me. Of course, God never forces us. This had to involve some cooperation on my part, too. It's funny, when I first started teaching, I sometimes felt a little awkward walking into meetings where there were often few women and mostly men, and generally they were priests. I did not want to stand out. I even thought that maybe I shouldn't wear lipstick, or at least not bright lipstick. I certainly tended to wear a lot of black, and if you ask my mother, she'd probably say I wear too much black today. Anyway, it was around this time that I started reading what John Paul had to say about the genius of women. I came to realize that, well, first, even without the lipstick, one of these things was not like the other. I also came to appreciate that being a woman, the fact that I had been shaped by some distinctive experiences could be a very good thing in my work. I came to see that sometimes I do bring a perspective that is complementary, and this is a good thing too. I've always tried to make my teaching student-focused. Yes, it is about the material, and the intellectual challenge is rewarding, most days. But real joy comes when you see that a particular student has connected with some material, when you see that he or she is somehow changed. I think this is what John Paul is talking about. And as you can see, I've come to terms with the fact that while I'm trying to be an effective teacher, I might as well try and put my best face forward. I've made my peace with lipstick, and I don't think it's damaged my credibility. When we talk about each person's unique vocation, there is no formula. So I invite you, when you have a little time and headspace, to consider, what unique work or task is God calling you to do, precisely as the woman you are? What unique strengths and weaknesses can you place in service of others? Can you identify a human need in your world that you are especially equipped to meet? Whoever we are, whatever our age, we have a gift to make. There are always important things to do. How can we make ourselves available? I think these are pretty exciting questions at any stage of life. Your journey may be with lipstick or without, with biological children or without, with the gift of a great education or without much formal education. It may be with a supportive family or not. Your unique circumstances may involve health or a chronic illness or even a serious medical issue. The idea is that God's loving and often surprising plans for us will make use of our distinctive gifts and sometimes even the difficult aspects of our lives. Even in the hard moments, maybe especially in the hard moments, God is shaping us into the workers He needs us to be. Our task is to leave room for grace, for growth, and to follow where God is leading us. And of course, it always helps to keep a sense of humor. And if we really want to be fruitful, we should never forget that while our own finite human resources can be pretty impressive on a good day, if we just rely on ourselves, we're certain to run into trouble, and perhaps even burn out. We are bound to encounter failures in ourselves and disappointments. As women of faith, as women of the Word, the real trick is to make ourselves available for the Holy Spirit. We must let ourselves, all the aspects of our feminine genius, become God's instruments. I want to mention one little book that's been a huge help to me. It's by Father Jacques Philippe, and it is called Searching for and Maintaining Peace, a small treatise on peace of heart. I can't do justice to this little gem, but I do want to finish by sharing just a few key insights. As Father Philippe writes, the heart that allows itself to be driven by the Holy Spirit and God is able to do more by His grace than the heart could do by its own effort. According to Father Philippe, the basic problem of the spiritual and moral life is this: how can I let Jesus act in me? How can I permit the grace of God to freely operate in me? One thing is absolutely necessary, and that is that we have to find a way to keep peace of heart. Father Philippe suggests the image of the surface of the lake, with the sun shining on it. If the surface is tranquil, the sun will be reflected. But if the surface is agitated, the image of the sun can't be reflected. And so it is with God and us. The more our soul is at peace, the more God is reflected in it. the more His grace can operate through us. God is a God of peace. Does this mean we can then be passive in life or that our actions don't matter? Absolutely not. As we've seen, we must cooperate, using our intelligence and will, all our gifts, with God's designs. But when we have true peace of heart, we'll be liberated from self-preoccupation, which gets pretty boring. We'll be more sensitive to the needs of others. The problem is that we often try to go rogue. In fact, this was Adam and Eve's problem too. But when we try to resolve everything by ourselves, we eventually become discouraged and agitated. And as Father Philippe points out, this is exactly where the devil wants us. I know some would say it's a bit old-fashioned or even spooky to talk about the devil, but I have noticed with great interest that Pope Francis talks about him quite a bit. There must be a reason. The devil knows that God abides in peace, so he will do anything he can to make us anxious. As St. Francis de Sales observed, none of the thoughts that render us anxious and agitated in spirit in any way comes from God. These are temptations of the enemy and must be resisted. Yet, as we all know, humanly speaking, there is no shortage of things to worry about. In a fallen world, injustices and oppressions, often against women, are all too real. Sexual violence is a part of life for many women. We may fear being without health, without material possessions, or without influence. Many experience loneliness. And since we seem to be especially wired for relationship, I wonder if loneliness affects women more than men. There is also the fear of suffering, perhaps our own or the suffering of others. Or we may worry about something we've done. Maybe we've hurt someone we love. I know we each have our own lists. But if keeping peace of mind is all important, how do we do it? What does Father Philippe suggest? As he makes clear, he's not talking about the fragile and superficial peace that the world offers us. Our external circumstances can change on a dime. Again, I urge you to read Father Philippe for yourself, but there are two words that he comes back to time and again: trust and abandonment into God's will. We must believe that God loves us and only wants good things for us. He will never leave us wanting for anything that we really need. Again, God will meet us where we are. He ran out to meet the prodigal son, the father did, and I suspect that the daughter too. Here's a very encouraging thought also. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. And all the saints tell us that if we try to make a habit of prayer and receive the graces of the sacraments, our confidence will grow. It will be easier to trust. Father Philippe quotes a saint called Marie of the Incarnation. She put it this way: if we could, with a single interior glance, see all the goodness and mercy that exists in God's designs for each one of us, even in what we call disgraces, pains, and afflictions, our happiness would consist in throwing ourselves in the arms of the divine will, with the abandon of a young child that throws himself into the arms of his mother. Like a little child, we must throw ourselves into God's arms. Maybe sometimes we make it more complicated than it needs to be. May is the month of Mary. Why do we honor her so? People often wonder. Quite simply, Mary is the model for all persons, for women and men. Why? Even when she did not fully understand God's designs, she said yes. In putting herself at God's service, she also put herself at the service of others, a service of love. And in this, she is the highest expression of the feminine genius. If we follow her model, we will certainly give expression to our own feminine genius. We will have a lasting peace of heart and our lives will be fruitful in ways we could only have imagined. Thank you.